New York City, 1937. Rain hits the pavement as a black Cadillac slows to a stop in Little Italy. Men step aside. No one dares to make eye contact. The man walking out isn't just another gangster. He's Vito Genovese, a name whispered in fear across the entire underworld. To his enemies, he was a ghost. To his friends, a reminder that loyalty could vanish with a single order. Vito wasn't content with power. He wanted domination. While others built empires, he planned to own them all. Every boss, every soldier, every racket, under one rule, his. Behind his calm eyes hid a man capable of anything: betrayal, murder, even political manipulation on 2 continents. From the violent alleys of Manhattan to the marble halls of Mussolini's Italy, Genovese built a criminal network unlike anything America had ever seen. But the higher he climbed, the darker his world became. Every ally turned suspicious. Every move became a gamble. This is the story of the Mafia's most feared Don, a man who reached for absolute power, crushed everyone in his path, and paid the ultimate price for wanting to rule them all. Before he became one of the most feared mafia bosses in American history, Vito Genovese was just another immigrant kid from Naples trying to survive the streets of New York. But unlike others, Vito wasn't looking for a job or a dream. He was looking for control. From the very beginning, he understood something most men didn't. Fear was more powerful than respect. He joined the ranks of the Italian mobsters during the Prohibition era, when alcohol was illegal and money flowed like blood through the city's veins. Working under Lucky Luciano, Vito learned the art of crime: how to kill without mercy, how to bribe without getting caught, and how to command loyalty through terror. But inside his mind, a bigger plan was forming. Vito didn't want to be a partner in crime. He wanted to be the king of it. His ambitions stretched far beyond one family. He believed the Mafia should be ruled by a single man: himself. As the years passed, he outsmarted rivals, betrayed allies, and built a criminal empire that reached from New York to Italy. But power always comes with a cost. And for Vito Genovese, that cost would be everything: his allies, his freedom, and eventually, his life. This is the untold rise and fall of a man who tried to rule the entire Mafia, and nearly succeeded. The story of Vito Genovese begins in the crowded streets of Little Italy, New York City, a place where poverty, survival, and crime walked hand in hand. Born in Naples in 1897, Vito arrived in America as a poor immigrant. But unlike others who dreamed of honest work, he saw the criminal world as his true opportunity. The streets didn't scare him, they shaped him. By the 1920s, Prohibition had turned New York into a gold mine for organized crime. Alcohol was banned, but the demand was endless. And where there's demand, there's profit. Vito started small, running errands and collecting debts for the Italian Mafia. He quickly earned a reputation for being cold, efficient, and absolutely fearless. If someone owed money, Vito collected, and if they refused, they vanished. It wasn't long before his brutality caught the attention of Charles Lucky Luciano, a young, intelligent gangster who was building a new kind of criminal empire. Luciano wasn't like the old bosses. He believed in structure, in business, and in modernization, and he needed men who were willing to do anything to make his vision real. Vito was perfect for that role. Working side by side, Luciano and Genovese began reshaping the underworld. They broke old traditions, eliminating anyone who stood in their way, including Joe Masseria, the old-school mafia boss who ruled with arrogance and chaos. In 1931, Luciano arranged for Masseria's assassination during a card game. It was Vito Genovese who helped set the trap, ensuring Luciano's rise to the top of New York's criminal hierarchy. With Masseria gone, the Mafia was restructured into 5 families, each with its own boss. But Luciano's family, the Luciano crime family, was the most powerful. Vito was rewarded for his loyalty and promoted to underboss, the second most powerful position in the organization. From that moment, his influence began to spread like wildfire. But unlike Luciano, who preferred diplomacy and alliances, Vito believed in ruling through fear. He saw kindness as weakness and mercy as betrayal. Where Luciano negotiated, Vito threatened. Where Luciano spared, Vito killed. Inside the Mafia, people whispered that Genovese was the man you called when no one else had the stomach to do the job. By 1934, Vito was overseeing drug trafficking, gambling, extortion, and murder-for-hire operations across the East Coast. Money poured in, and his name became synonymous with control. Even among criminals, he was feared, not just for his violence, but for his cold intelligence. But ambition doesn't sleep. While he worked under Luciano, Vito started to imagine something bigger. He didn't just want to be underboss. He wanted to be the boss of bosses. And in 1936, fate gave him the perfect opportunity. That year, Lucky Luciano was arrested and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison for running a massive prostitution ring. The throne of the most powerful mafia family in America suddenly stood empty, and Vito made his move. He took control of operations, claiming he was only helping out until Luciano returned. But everyone knew he had no intention of stepping aside. Under Genovese's command, the family grew even more ruthless. He tightened his grip on the docks, the unions, and the narcotics trade. Rivals were quietly eliminated, bodies disappeared, and even his allies began to fear him. Vito wasn't leading a business anymore. He was building an empire of terror. But his hunger for power came at a cost. In 1937, his name surfaced in a high-profile murder case, the killing of Ferdinand Boccia, a minor mobster who had crossed him in a deal. When witnesses began to talk, Vito realized he couldn't bribe or intimidate his way out this time. So, he made a decision that stunned everyone. He fled the country. Vito Genovese left behind his growing empire and escaped to Italy, not as a defeated man, but as a strategist making his next move. He carried millions in cash, gold, and connections, ready to rebuild his power somewhere new. While most men would hide in fear, Vito saw his exile as an opportunity, a chance to extend his reach beyond New York and into Europe itself. And as he stepped onto Italian soil, the next chapter of his story began, the rise of a Don who would soon command not one nation's underworld, but two. The streets of New York whispered his name in fear. In Italy, he would make the world learn it. When Vito Genovese fled New York in 1937, most assumed his reign was over. The American authorities wanted him for murder, and the Mafia expected him to disappear quietly. But Vito wasn't the type to vanish. He was the type to rebuild, and Italy became his new empire. He returned to Naples, the city of his birth, carrying wealth, influence, and a plan. Italy in the late 1930s was ruled by Benito Mussolini, whose fascist government valued money and power. Two things Genovese had in abundance. Vito began using his connections and wealth to support Mussolini's regime, presenting himself as a loyal Italian patriot. In truth, he was buying protection, power, and opportunity. Soon, he was seen dining with fascist officers, businessmen, and politicians. He became a quiet but influential figure in Naples's black market, controlling everything from construction materials to smuggled goods. But even in exile, Vito couldn't resist using violence to solve his problems. One of his most notorious acts came in 1943, when he allegedly ordered the assassination of Carlo Tresca, an Italian-American journalist living in New York, who openly criticized Mussolini. Tresca's murder shocked both America and Italy, and though Genovese was thousands of miles away, the FBI suspected his hand behind it. It was a chilling message. Vito could kill across oceans. Then came World War II, and once again, Vito saw chaos as an opportunity. When the Allies invaded Italy in 1943, Mussolini's power crumbled. Most of his supporters fled or were executed, but not Vito. He quickly changed sides, presenting himself as an ally to the Americans. Fluent in English and well-connected in Naples, he began working with the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Unit, claiming to help restore order in southern Italy. To American officers unfamiliar with his criminal past, Vito seemed like a godsend, a local man who could get things done. He supplied the military with housing, food, and transportation. But behind the scenes, he was using the same system to rebuild his criminal empire. U.S. military supplies disappeared, black market deals flourished, and every new connection Vito made became another weapon in his growing power. It was during this time that Vito's corruption reached its peak. Reports began surfacing of Genovese stealing military goods, taking bribes, and even ordering the murder of anyone who tried to expose him. Yet somehow, he remained untouchable. The Americans saw him as useful, the Italians feared him, and the Mafia back in New York still whispered his name. By 1944, however, his double life began to unravel. U.S. investigators stationed in Naples uncovered evidence linking him to criminal activities and to the murder of Ferdinand Boccia years earlier in New York. Suddenly, the man who thought he had escaped justice found the past catching up with him. In 1945, the U.S. military police arrested Vito Genovese and prepared to extradite him back to America. The Mafia world buzzed with shock. The man who had fled across an ocean was being dragged back in handcuffs. But even then, Vito refused to act defeated. He remained calm, confident, even smiling for the cameras as he was led away. He knew one truth that would define the rest of his life. Power doesn't die in a cell. It waits. When he arrived back in New York, Vito's connections and money worked their magic. The key witness in the Boccia murder case conveniently died before the trial, and with no evidence left, the charges were dropped. Vito Genovese was a free man once again. But this time, he wasn't just a returning fugitive. He was a legend. He had survived exile, war, and near execution. He had fooled Mussolini, manipulated the U.S. Army, and walked out of prison untouched. The Mafia world had changed during his absence. Frank Costello now ran Luciano's old family, running it like a business empire, preferring peace over blood. To most, that was progress. To Vito, it was weakness. And as he looked over the glittering skyline of New York once more, one thought burned in his mind. The throne was empty, and it belonged to him. When Vito Genovese returned to New York in 1946, the underworld had changed, but not in the way he feared. His old friend and rival, Lucky Luciano, was gone, deported to Italy after his prison release. The Luciano crime family was now in the hands of Frank Costello, a calm, business-minded don who valued influence over violence. To the public, Costello was the prime minister of the underworld, the man who made deals with judges and politicians instead of bullets and blood. But to Vito, that made him weak. Genovese looked at Costello's leadership and saw an opportunity, one he had waited nearly a decade for. The family he once helped build was now his to reclaim. He just had to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the man sitting in his chair. Vito started small. He didn't come back shouting for power. He came back smiling. He pledged loyalty to Costello, acting as a friend, even a supporter. Behind the scenes, however, he was quietly gathering strength. He began building alliances with ambitious young soldiers, men who were dissatisfied with Costello's cautious style. Vito promised them something Costello couldn't: the return of real mafia power, where fear ruled and money flowed without limits. He expanded his network through bribery, intimidation, and loyalty bought with cash. His presence in the family grew heavier by the day, like a shadow creeping closer to the throne. The Luciano family was slowly becoming the Genovese family, though no one dared to say it out loud. By the early 1950s, Costello could sense the storm brewing. The FBI was closing in on mobsters nationwide, and politicians were distancing themselves from the underworld. Costello tried to maintain peace, focusing on legitimate fronts: gambling, unions, construction. But Vito saw that as surrender. He believed the Mafia was built on fear and control, not public respectability. To reclaim power, Genovese needed to remove Costello without sparking an all-out war. So, he began whispering in the right ears. Men like Albert Anastasia, the brutal head of Murder, Inc., and Carlo Gambino, a calculating underboss with his own ambitions. Vito played both sides, pretending to be their ally while using their conflicts to weaken them. When Anastasia started growing too powerful, Vito supported a plan that would later see him assassinated, clearing another obstacle from his path. And when Carlo Gambino saw Vito's intelligence and control, he quietly pledged support. Piece by piece, Genovese built a coalition strong enough to topple any boss in New York. Then came the defining moment. In May 1957, Costello was leaving his apartment building on Central Park West when a young hitman, Vincent the Chin Gigante, stepped out of the shadows. One bullet grazed Costello's head, narrowly missing his brain. The Don staggered, bleeding but alive, and as the shooter fled, he shouted, "This is for you, Vito!" Costello survived the attempt, but got the message loud and clear. A few days later, he announced his retirement from the Mafia. The throne was empty once more, and this time, Vito Genovese didn't hesitate. He declared himself boss of the family, restoring his name to the top of the New York underworld. But his hunger didn't stop there. He wanted everything: control over all 5 families, unification of the Mafia under one supreme ruler, and so began what the FBI later called the blood war for power. To Vito, the Mafia wasn't a business. It was a kingdom, and he was determined to be its king. But the problem with ruling through fear is that it breeds enemies faster than loyalty. The other families, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo, watched him closely, uneasy about his growing influence. Still, Vito pressed on. He saw himself as untouchable. The police couldn't stop him. The families couldn't unite against him. He had finally become what he always dreamed of, the most feared Don in America. But in the Mafia, power never stays in one pair of hands for long. Vito's next move would take him from the dark streets of New York to a meeting that would expose the entire criminal world and bring him closer to the beginning of his end. By 1957, Vito Genovese was at the height of his power. Frank Costello had been pushed out, Albert Anastasia was dead, and the Luciano family, now renamed the Genovese family, ruled New York's underworld with an iron fist. But for Vito, controlling one family wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted to rule every Mafia family in America. To achieve that, Vito needed one thing: recognition. The other bosses respected him, but none were ready to bow. So, he devised a bold plan: to bring together the most powerful Mafia leaders from across the United States and declare himself the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. The secret meeting was set for November 14th, 1957, in a quiet, upstate New York town called Appalachian. It was hosted at the estate of mobster Joseph Barbara, a man trusted to provide privacy and security. Over 100 Mafia bosses and high-ranking capos from New York, Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, and even Cuba made their way to the rural mansion. Expensive Cadillacs lined the driveway, and men in suits filled the property. On the agenda, narcotics profits, territorial disputes, and most importantly, Vito Genovese's rise to supreme leadership. But what Vito didn't know was that this meeting, meant to crown him king, would become the greatest disaster in Mafia history. That morning, Ed Croswell, a vigilant state trooper, noticed dozens of luxury cars with out-of-town license plates parked outside Barbara's home. Suspicious, he called for backup. Within minutes, local police surrounded the area. When officers approached the mansion, chaos exploded. Mafia bosses, men who ruled cities and countries, scrambled through the woods in panic. Suits were torn, shoes were lost, and the American public got its first real glimpse of the Mafia's hidden empire. Dozens were arrested, their photos splashed across newspapers nationwide. The Appalachian meeting exposed what law enforcement had long suspected: that the Mafia wasn't just a loose network of criminals, but a powerful national organization with hierarchy, leadership, and structure. And at the center of that discovery was Vito Genovese. For the FBI, this was gold. Until that point, they had publicly denied the Mafia's existence. Now, they had undeniable proof, and a new public enemy to focus on. Vito went from shadow ruler to the most wanted mobster in America. The fallout was immediate. Federal agents raided Genovese's businesses, investigated his financial records, and interrogated his allies. Politicians who once took his money now refused his calls. Within months, the empire he'd spent decades building began to crumble under the weight of national attention. Inside the Mafia, other bosses turned against him. Many blamed Vito for the disaster at Appalachian, calling it reckless and arrogant. Even Carlo Gambino, who had once supported him, began distancing himself. Vito's dream of being the undisputed king had now made him the most hated man in organized crime. But Genovese wasn't finished yet. Determined to hold his power, he doubled down on his criminal operations, especially narcotics. He expanded heroin trafficking networks from Italy to America, using military routes and corrupt dock workers to move millions of dollars worth of drugs each month. It was risky, but he believed he was untouchable. Then, in 1959, his arrogance finally caught up with him. Federal agents arrested Vito on narcotics trafficking charges, accusing him of running a massive international drug operation. He claimed innocence, calling it a government setup. But this time, his enemies weren't just on the streets. They were in the courtroom too. Rival mobsters, tired of his reign, testified against him. That year, Vito Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The self-proclaimed boss of all bosses was led away in handcuffs, his empire collapsing behind him. He had tried to unite the Mafia under one ruler. Instead, he exposed it to the world, and as the prison gates closed behind him, one truth became clear: the higher the climb, the harder the fall. By the late 1950s, Vito Genovese finally stood where he had always wanted, at the top of the Mafia world. The commission, once controlled by Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, now bent to his will. Every major crime family in America had to answer to Vito. His empire stretched across drugs, gambling, labor rackets, and even international politics. He had outlived enemies, silenced traitors, and turned fear into loyalty. But behind that empire, cracks were already forming, and those cracks would soon destroy everything he built. Vito's greatest mistake was thinking he could control everything and everyone, including men as dangerous as himself. He underestimated the ambition of others, especially those who once admired him. His power made him reckless. He began bragging openly, claiming he was the true boss of all bosses, a title the Mafia itself had outlawed years ago to avoid drawing government attention. That arrogance became his undoing. The FBI, now focused on organized crime more than ever, made Genovese their prime target. His enemies saw an opportunity. Rival mobsters, including Carlo Gambino and Frank Costello's remaining loyalists, worked behind the scenes with federal agents to set him up. It all came crashing down in 1959 when Vito was arrested in a massive heroin trafficking operation, a setup orchestrated by those closest to him. He believed he was untouchable, but he had been double-crossed by his own associates. In court, Vito stood with cold defiance, certain he'd beat the charges. But this time, the witnesses didn't disappear, the evidence didn't vanish, and the judge wasn't bought. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. For the first time in decades, the man who once ruled the underworld found himself behind bars, stripped of his power, surrounded by men who either feared or hated him. Inside Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, Vito still tried to run things from the inside. He controlled smuggling rings within prison walls, sent orders to his men outside, and even demanded respect from inmates. But the Mafia had already moved on. Carlo Gambino quietly rose as the new power in New York, taking over the commission and reshaping the underworld in his image. Vito's dream of absolute control died the moment he stepped into his cell. As the years passed, his health declined. Once a man feared by presidents, judges, and killers alike, Vito Genovese became just another old gangster behind bars, angry, forgotten, and paranoid. In 1969, he suffered a fatal heart attack in prison, marking the end of an era. Yet even in death, his influence remained. The Genovese crime family, the very organization he created, became the most powerful and disciplined family in America, outlasting nearly every other mafia dynasty. His name lived on, whispered in the dark corners of Little Italy and the federal archives of the FBI. Vito Genovese's story isn't just about crime. It's about the cost of absolute ambition. He reached for power that no one man could hold, betrayed everyone to get it, and in the end, lost it all. The Mafia never crowned another boss of bosses again, because Vito's fall proved that even kings in the underworld don't rule forever.